And thank you also for inviting me once again to be the instructor of record for the Spring 2020 Arts of Asia lecture series, Visions of the Afterlife. It's always such a pleasure to work with the Society for Asian Art, and it's also such a pleasure to see all of you here in the audience. Given that my first lecture for the Society for Asian Art was 28 years ago. It was in Golden Gate Park. And so over the years, I've really come to view the Society for Asian Art as part of my family. So I'm very, very pleased to be here. And hopefully you'll keep inviting me to come back. Now, I want to begin by saying that the title of my talk is a little bit misleading. Since I will get to Qizil only in the latter part of my talk. My lecture today, more broadly, will look at hell. Hell as a destination in the afterlife. Specifically, I'd like to focus on three things. First, on the emergence of the concept of hell in West Asia and South Asia traditions. And I want to do that in comparative perspective. Why West Asia and South Asia? That's my area of specialization, including Central Asia. I know much less about East Asia, but I'm hoping that other speakers in this lecture series will cover that geographic range. So the first part was on the emergence. The second, I want to talk about ideas concerning hell in the Buddhist tradition. Lastly, and if I time this all right, in the second half of my talk will be specifically on the Buddhist site at Kissel. It's a cave temple site dated to the first millennium of the Common Era. Before I start, though, I want to preface my talk with two remarks. By the way, I love Mark Twain's the quote by Mark Twain. First, it is important to understand the limitations of using the term hell here. The place we are looking at is donated in various ways in different traditions, depending on the cultural context. And so the exact meaning may not always correspond to the Christian idea of hell. So this is a definition of where the term hell comes from Old English, and then ultimately probably from Proto-Germanic. So it refers to the abode of the dead, the infernal regions, place of torment for the wicked after death. But there are other terms. The ancient Greeks referred to it as Tartarus. In Islamic sources, in Arabic, it's referred to as Jahannam. The Chinese texts refer to it as Diyu. And in Sanskrit, it's called Naraka. And in Pali, Niraya. So that's the first point I want to make, that it's important to kind of keep that in mind. The second point is that I don't want to elaborate on whether the texts describe an actual place where you go or a psychological state of being. And I think the scholarly opinions are divided on that. What did the Buddhists really mean when they were talking about hell? Were they talking about a psychological hell, or were they really talking about a place where you go in the afterlife? So that discussion is an important one, an interesting one, but it's not of concern to my talk today. When did the idea of the existence of hell first emerge? A very complicated question, and I'm afraid we have no clear answer to that. What we can say for sure is that across West Asia and South Asian, West and South Asia, religious traditions seem to have a similar trajectory. They go from vague notions of a somewhat dark and gloomy underworld. It's often located below the earth as opposed to the abode of the gods above. that later then morphs into a more binary understanding of the afterlife. In other words, light versus darkness comes later. Good versus evil, good states of being and bad states of being. And in this regard, I found Nick Veldhuis's lecture quite illuminating, because he discussed early Mesopotamian traditions of the afterlife during the 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE. And he did it through literary accounts, because there just aren't any visual representations during that time. They come later. In ancient Mesopotamia, the underworld was where all the dead were headed. Didn't matter who you were. It was a dark and gloomy place where the dead lived in darkness, and where the dead's fate in the underworld was dictated by how the living conducted their rituals to the dead. So their peace had something to do with how the living acted. Now he talked about, I give you the seal that he showed. He talked about the descent of Ishtar or Inanna, who went to the underworld, and describes it when she comes back. Now, it's important to understand here that when Ishtar goes down to the underworld, it is described as she's visiting Kur, or the ground, or the land of no return. When you go to the underworld, you're not coming back. Only extraordinary individuals were able to travel and tell about it. Ishtar, being of course a goddess, was one. So what Nick suggested is that it was a vague place, and really the Mesopotamians were much more concerned with the living than they were with the dead. In ancient Egypt, and this is also what Professor Veldhuis remarked upon in his talk, they were obsessed with death, unlike the Mesopotamians. But it's very important to understand that here too, the afterlife is not binary, and hell does not seem to be a place of existence. The afterlife is a very fertile plain where there is no suffering, there is no death, where immortals live, ultimately. A very, very pleasant life. The journey to get there is harrowing, to say the least, because you have to pass a trial by the god Osiris, as you can see here on this papyrus. That is an arduous journey where you are tested, and ultimately your good and bad actions are weighed. And so here you can see the central part of the papyrus, and you can see a number of figures that many of you probably know well. Anubis, who leads the dead in front of Osiris. He also is in charge of weighing the heart. You see the scale. You see Thoth, who is the scribe, and he's taking notes about your life. In this regard, Hanefer passes the test, because you can see here that the heart is lighter than the feather. If it's the other way around, this creature, crocodile, hippopotamus, and lion, will just snap the heart and snuff out existence. So that's it. There's no sort of bad place. You're just gone. Right? There's no plane of existence. Now, when you look at the ancient Greeks, you see a similar pattern. In older Greek myths, the underworld is misty, gloomy. It's an abode of the dead where all the mortals go when they die. It's named after its eponymous god, Hades, as you can see here in the sculpture. And the dog, his dog, Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guards the afterlife. Part of that story is probably very familiar to you, or the descriptions of Hades. So here you see an 18th century engraving depicting that underworld of Greek mythology. So there's Charon or Charon. He's the ferryman who ferries the soul of the departed across the river Styx. At the left you see Hades and his wife, Persephone, and in front you can see the guard dog of the afterlife. So the soul of the departed, all the departed, were therefore the population of Hades' realm. Now, it's interesting to think of the binary here because it follows the Mesopotamian pattern a bit. There were two realms in Hades that were singled out, that approximate the idea of a binary afterlife, but they weren't initially reserved for mortals. The first one, the bad one, was Tartarus, hell. And this is where the enemies of the gods were sent, not mortals. But if you plotted against the gods or tried to kill the gods, you went to Tartarus. And Tartarus is where you then would be devoured by vultures. You can see it in this Titian painting of the 16th century, where the vulture is picking at the body of Titus. Titus was sent to Tartarus for the rape of the goddess Leto. He was ultimately killed by her children, Artemis and Apollo, and then he is ferried to Tartarus. Now this shows a bit eternal punishment seeping in. But again, it wasn't really for mere mortals. On the other side, you have the Elysian fields, or Elysium. Again, admission there was reserved for friends of the gods. So you could either be the enemies of the gods or the friends of the gods. The heroes of mythology might end up there. It's only later that you start to see Tartarus and the Elysium fields as destinations also for mortals. So again, how do we account for these shifts? And these shifts occur sometime in the mid-first millennium BCE. And you see those shifts in the texts. Some say, well, you can find it in philosophy. You can think of Plato, the Republic. He writes about good and bad. He talks about the binary. It's a manual for how society stays orderly. If you do good, keep in line, right? Then you will go to heaven, and if you don't, you will go to hell. So it could be that there was something within society, something in the ideas of these very important thinkers. Now, the last part of the Republic is the myth of And this is where you, for the first time, see sort of in Greek writing a real account of the binary, of what is bad and what is good. So he said that when his soul left the body, he went on a journey with a great company, and that they came to a mysterious place at which there were two openings in the earth. They were near together, and over against them were two other openings in the heaven above. In the intermediate space, there were judges seated, who commanded the just, after they had given judgment of them and had bound their sentences in front of them, to ascend by the heavenly way on the right hand, and in like manner the unjust were bidden by them to descend by the lower way to the left hand. And these also bore the symbols of their deeds, but fastened on their backs. The protagonist of the myth of is who is able to travel to the afterlife and come back and talk about it. Talk about what he saw. Early Judaism, as outlined, in his wonderful lecture, Ron Hendel described a similar pattern in the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible. And he talked about how immortality of the soul was not really a concern in early Judaism. Therefore, Sheol is simply a destination of the dead. And it's a shadowy place, a place of sleep. And in this case, heaven is really where God is, right? It's not literally then is a better translation is a bad existence, right? So this is where the binary becomes very much more clear. The Chinwat Bridge, we don't have a lot of depictions of it in the early period. It comes later. And you see it in a very famous sarcophagus, a Sogdian sarcophagus, that was uncovered in China, in Xi'an, dated to the 6th century CE. And it's a sarcophagus of a Sogdian merchant, was buried in it with his wife. And on one of the panels, you see a beautiful depiction of the bridge. And you can see people walking over the bridge. If your souls are there's judgment. If your soul is good, you can keep walking and cross the river and go into the afterlife, various planes of paradise. If you're bad, you just plunge into the deep cesspool below the bridge, where you are eaten or torn apart by dogs and other creatures. So you have here then this idea of the binary very, very clearly. And for a lot of scholars, this mid-first millennium BCE era, where you see Plato, where you see writers or the authors of biblical books, you see a simultaneous shift into the binary. So that's very important to understand when you think about the emergence of hell. Now, the Iranic shares a lot with the Indic. They come from the same source, an Indo-Iranian source. So what's happening in the Indic tradition? In early writing, in Vedic writing, the concept of hell is really, well, it doesn't really exist. The netherworld is a pit where people are sent for acts against the gods. Ultimately, there too, it will go from this vague pit to a place of moral retribution in exactly the same period as all the others do as well. In Vedic tradition, the helm is located south. It's beneath the earth, like in Mesopotamia, like in Judaism, below all the creatures of earth. It's an endless pit. It's a pit of disappearance. Nobody knows what happens there in early Vedic tradition. So there is a sense of the afterlife, but it's very abstract in the Vedas. It's not as concrete. The god associated with the realm of the dead is Yama, and you know him well, right? He's a directional deity, especially in the Vedas, of the south, and that's also the abode of, right, the Indic underworld, if you will. The Vedas describe him as the first man who died, and therefore, right, carved out a space. And then he is followed by all humans. So again, Yama has a kind of vague role in early tradition. Later, he's a judge. Actually, in early tradition, he's somewhat cheerful. He doesn't punish. He just sort of presides over the realm of the departed, of the dead. But over time, he turns into a judge and he weighs the good and the bad of the people who die. And then he determines retribution. And we'll talk about retribution in the context of Buddhism. Later Indian art really depicts Yama like a judge in an administrative function. I think Professor Bose showed you a miniature where he is seated in his, if you will, his office. There's a scribe who writes down who did what, who did something bad, and then Yama will judge. Right? Chitragupta is the scribe. So here you can see him seated. Interestingly, Yama, and this goes back to Hades, Cerberus, also has 2 dogs that guard the netherworld. Not 3, not a 3-headed one, but they're dogs involved as well. So the dog is quite often associated with the negative afterlife, if you will. Professor Bose showed you the Karni Barni prints and talked about them. They're usually 19th century prints. There's a very interesting article about the politics of those prints. They became very popular during this time. And a lot of people will use these images to talk about the hell realms in Hindu tradition. But what's really interesting is why these became so popular in the 19th century, right? And again, I think the answer is not a logical, hell realms exist in Hinduism, they've existed all the time. It's what's happening in the 19th century. What is this emphasis on morality, right? It's a bit like what Plato did in the 5th and 4th century BCE, is saying, if you cause dissension, this is what will happen to you, to keep this orderly, right? And you want to go to heaven or you want to go to a nice place, then keep in line with the program. And there's much more writing now about the political context in which these images were produced. But that's for another time. We finally landed with Buddhism. Now, where does Buddhism differ? And you know this, of course, very well with Brahmanical society or with the Vedas. It differs because it was very critical of Brahmanical society. For one thing, Brahmanical society was dominated by the so-called caste system. The ritual form of worship predominated in Brahmanical society, and who was in charge of the rituals and insight into the text? They were the Brahmins. And so Buddhism was very critical of that, the status of the privileged classes. But ultimately, Buddhism too is an Indic tradition, so it inherits a lot of what the Vedas and the later Indic text wrote. So the common traits are reincarnation, the idea that you are reincarnated, liberation, moksha, and it shares that with Hinduism and Jainism as well. But each tradition has a different iteration and different ideas and descriptions of what that exactly entailed. Now, Naraka, Niraya, the Pali, Naraka as hell, the Sanskrit, are terms that you also see in Hinduism. And the appearance of the hell realms in Hinduism seemed to be parallel with the appearance of hell realms in Buddhism. So ultimately, in the same time period, the Indic traditions also undergo a shift from this more abstract kind of thinking about a netherworld to a more binary explanation. There are good states of being and bad states of being. So, Buddhism, to to some degree, takes the afterlife of the space that is ruled by Yama and turns it into separate realms of reward and retribution. And Yama, like in Hinduism, then transforms from a god of the dead to a god who rules the hell realms, very specifically. Now, unlike the Buddha, who you see here in a painting, a very beautiful painting from the Kissel grottoes, we, as human beings, have no other recourse than to be reborn in one of 6 realms of Buddhism. Those of the gods, the asuras or demons, the humans, the hungry ghosts, the animals, or hell. And what determines it, as you well know, it is karma. Right? Your good versus your bad karma will ultimately decide which realm you are born in. But unlike other tradition where you have punishment, in particular you have wrathful deities that kind of send you to a negative space or a wonderful space, it's really your own action that will lead you to be reborn in a specific space. So how do we know what those spaces are? Where do these ideas of hell, where are they described? Well, some come from the Buddhist, the most important Buddhist tradition itself, the so-called Tripitaka, or 3 baskets of Buddhism. It's basically a compilation of 3 sources. The sutta or sutras, that are the words of the Buddha or the teachings of the Buddha, the teachings that were heard by someone from the mouth of the Buddha. There's the Vinaya, which is the rules by which monks need to live, the monastic discipline that governs a monastery. And then you have the Abhidhamma or Abhidharma, a kind of basket of higher learning. This is where everything gets explained of what the Buddha meant. Because the Buddha teaches, those teachings are collected, but somebody needs to explain exactly what's going on. What was meant when the Buddha talks about this? How do we interpret that? And in fact, in the Abhidhamma, you have lots of disagreements. There are lots of monastic communities that have very different interpretations of what it meant. So I just give you a couple of examples of that. So this is from a sutra that's called the Devadatta Sutra. Monks, Devadatta is overcome and his mind is obsessed by 8 evil things. Note, 8 evil things is also literally equals the 8 hells, of which he will inevitably go to the states of deprivation, that should be, to hell, for the duration of the age. What are the 8? They are gain, lack of gain, fame, lack of fame, honor, lack of honor, evil wishes, and evil friends. Devadatta will go to the states of deprivation, to hell for the duration of the age because he is overcome and his mind is obsessed by these 8 things. Devadatta was a cousin of the Buddha, and he's a very famous figure. In East Asian visual art, you have quite a few depictions of him. We can talk about that later. But his ultimate sin is that he goes against the Buddha himself. He even at one point tries to kill the Buddha, and then he tries to set a wild elephant onto the Buddha. And in this sutra, for that he lands in hell. Now, in early South Asian art, we don't have representations of the hell that he goes to. We do see some recognizable scenes in the art of Gandhara. So here, Devadatta, you probably all know the famous story where the Buddha tames the wild elephant, right? Nalagiri. In the Devadatta Sutra, she's made wild by Devadatta. And Devadatta wants the elephant to kill the Buddha. So ultimately, by giving the example of Devadatta, right, he explains where Devadatta will go. And in the Devadatta Sutra, he's not coming back. It's he's going to stay there for a long time, and it doesn't appear like he has a chance to, perhaps to return. Different from the East Asian tradition, where Devadatta is also described in the Lotus Sutra, where he ultimately does have a chance for redemption. He can come back. Now it's interesting, and I wish I could give you lots and lots of paintings of hell from the early periods. They just don't exist. It's only again in the modern tradition. Here is Devadatta in a sort of 19th century, 20th century print, and he ultimately, for his sins, to use that word, he is swallowed up by the earth and he goes straight to hell. Much more common in later tradition to be very explicit about what these hell realms look like. I just have a couple and then we can take a break. So that's the Sutra Pitaka, the basket of the sutras, one example where it's written. Another example is, you find it in the Vinaya, the monastic rules. This is a Gandharan relief of some of the disciples of the Buddha. Now, I'm going to read a passage. It's a very crass passage. So I'm going to give you a trigger warning. Those who don't like crassness, close your eyes and put your fingers in your ears. But this is one translation of the so-called parajikas. And parajikas are 4 very important rules, the first 4 rules that lead to defeat, that lead to expulsion from the monastic community. Everybody has chosen? Everybody wants to read it. It would be better for your male organ to enter a charcoal pit, burning a blaze fire, than to enter a woman. Why is that? Because for that reason you might die or experience deadly suffering. But you would not, on that account, at the breaking up of the body after death, be reborn in a plane of misery, a bad destination, the abyss, the hell. But for this reason, at the breaking up of the body after death, you might be reborn in the plane of misery, a bad destination, the abyss, hell. So, in addition to the expulsion, the automatic expulsion, the Vinaya vividly describes monks going to hell. Now, you can just read this, as many sort of Western scholars do, as a kind of psychological state. When a monk is expelled, of course, he's going to live in hell. So there are 4 rules, the most important rules that you may not break to remain in the monastic community. By the way, there are 8 for women. I'll leave it at that. The last basket, Abhidharma, is also interesting. Now, I gave you the title of a work, an article by Jens Bravik in the handout. It's a very interesting article on hell. And he talks about this book, the Katavatu, literally meaning, or it's a book, the points of controversy, attributed to Maudgalyayana, the president of the Third Buddhist Council of the 3rd century BCE. Now, what's interesting about this text, and I won't bore you with another paragraph of it, this is a discussion between monastic communities about all kinds of different things, about interpretations of what the Buddha meant. And in the Katavatu, they talk about what is meant with hell. How long do you stay in hell? Can a bodhisattva be reborn in hell? The argument about, well, that's not possible because once you're bodhisattva, you're on your way to Buddhahood. How can you be born in hell? Right? So the Abhidharma too talks about all these different instances where Buddhists are thinking about the binary, thinking about hell versus the states of pleasant being. The last work I want to mention is the Mahavastu. It's literally reads the great story, and it's a biography of the Buddha. And it's very interesting because it's attributed to a monastic sect of the northwest region, the Lokottaravada. There was a Lokottaravada community at Bamiyan. I say this because that too is an Iranic area, Iranian-speaking area. And the Lokottaravada are interesting. They're the first who, not first, they're the early iterations of the divinity of the Buddha. They are describing a transcendental Buddha, not the teacher of the Pali Canon, but the first references to somebody who's omniscient, omnipresent, supranatural. The Mahavastu starts off with hell, very detailed chapters on hell. Chapter 2 talks about the monk Maudgalyayana, and his visit to hell. He goes down and actually describes each hell that he visits and what happens in that hell. Then there is a broader sermon on hell that the Buddha supposedly gave, and then each sub-chapter is a description of particular hells. So they talk about Samjiva, Kala Sutra, Sangata, Raurava, Mahararava, Tapana, and Avicii. This is the passage. Now the Venerable Maudgalyayana often went on a visit to hell. There in the 8 great hells, each with its 16 secondary hells, he saw beings enduring thousands of different hellish torments. Many were torments when the Venerable Elder Kolita, that's his given name, saw beings suffering in hells as he went on his way. And then he described some Jeeva hell. People had their feet upward, heads downwards. They were being destroyed by hatchets, knives. Others again, instigated by malevolence, assailed one another with claws of iron, and in their hands appeared sharp sword blades with which they rent one another. Yet they do not die as long as their evil karmas are not exhausted. This is vivid descriptions of how when you go to hell, you just stay there for a very long time. And each time you die again and the torture begins again. Now this visit of Maudgalyayana mimics a lot of other sort of supreme beings who are able to come to hell, right? Visit hell. In the Greek tradition, Theseus and Heracles are able to go to Hades and come back. Ishtar is able to go down, come back. Maudgalyayana is able to go down and come back. Later, the Prophet in Islam will be able to transcend the realms and describe it. Now, what's interesting about this in terms of the East Asian tradition, and I'm not an East Asian specialist, is it turns into a very specific story of Mulyan, which is the East Asian Chinese name. And there he travels down, in particular to rescue his mother. Now when Maudgalyayana went, the spirits implored him and asked him to tell the living to take part in rituals to acquire karma, a merit field that would help them ultimately speed up, right, their departure out of hell. It's much more familial in East Asia. He's actually rescuing his mother. He goes down because he hears his mother cry out. And then the Buddha instructs him, well, go back and tell everybody to engage in actions that will increase her karma, that will allow her to be freed. When you take all those texts, and there's so many, and I don't, want to bore you to death with these passages, this is what you really come up with. This is the cosmology of the Indic tradition, which is not far removed from the cosmology of other traditions as well. You have Jambudvipa, the ocean continent, center of which is India. Above you have the heavens, and below you have the hells. initially 8 hot hells and 8 cold hells. And then as time goes by, you get increasing numbers of places that you can go that are good states of being and then bad states of being. Before we break, I want to just answer this question. Because as you will have noticed, I'm using a lot of different types of imagery to illustrate the points that I'm making. And in fact, the sense that you get, and you can't account for what survives and what doesn't survive. In archaeology, we just have to deal with what is extant. And you don't have a lot of images of hell in the early South Asian tradition at all. It comes in late medieval times, and perhaps, and as I said, with the Karni-Barni prints much later. And you don't see them in Central Asia either. Hell becomes prominent in East Asia, ultimately in Southeast Asia, in the Pali tradition. So again, we have to talk about these issues, but it's not always easy, right? Without an illustration to go with it. So after the break, we'll actually talk about what visual representations of hell actually exist, and then zero in on this site of Kissel in the oasis state of Kucha. Thank you. Representations, and in sort of South Asian tradition where you find depictions of hell. Again, they're very hard to find. One place you find them is in depictions of the so-called Wheel of Life. And the Wheel of Life is described in a particular Vinaya, the Mula Sarvastivadin Vinaya. Why is that one important? Well, its original is in the Sanskrit, dated to the 2nd and 5th century. But it was translated in the Chinese in the 8th and the Tibetan in the 9th. And that last translation is important because the Wheel of Life is particularly important in Tibetan tradition. You find it most prominently in Tibetan tankas. And the Vinaya gives an account about the Buddha giving instructions to represent a wheel of life, to illustrate the cycles that churn the universe, and to put that depiction on the outside wall of a monastery. Why the depiction? Remember the description of the monk Maudgalyayana who goes to hell, and he finds out, he talks to the residents of hell, and he comes back and says, well, we got to do this thing, and we got to do that thing. To prevent Maudgalyayana from having to go to hell too often, the Buddha suggests, well, let's put a wheel. Well, let's devise a wheel of life above a chakra, put it on the wall of a monastery, and use it as a didactic tool to teach Buddhist lay community, presumably in particular, what it means to be reborn in the afterlife. Now, how early do we have one? I think Professor Bose referenced it, but didn't give you an image of it. This is Ajanta Cave 17. It's a very broken painting of a wheel that is compartmentalized. The bottom part is gone. Technically, that's where you would find the realms of hell, so we don't know exactly what it would have depicted. It seems to be from the compartments that it also contained more realms than 6 realms. And that's a bit of an anomaly as well. But this would be a good example of putting a wheel on the outside of a monastery or on a cave temple in this instance. So in the text, the Buddha gives instructions about what the elements of the wheel of life are supposed to be. Let me give you the example of the Tibetan version. You know it well. It's very popular in tankas. You have the 12 interdependent causes on the outside, the link of dependent origination. That's why we're all just being reborn all the time. in the inner rim are depicted. You can't really see. Sometimes they're depictions of humans that either go downward or go upward. So they're basically represent the path to the upper and lower realm. And in the middle, you have greed, hatred, and delusion, or ignorance, being depicted by three animals. The snake, the cock, and the pig. And Professor Bose talked about that, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But it's clear that one of the six realms, and usually the southern one, the bottom one, depicts Naraka. And these are depictions of what happens to you when you land in hell. Now, they can be very detailed, they can be very schematic, they can be more abstract, more concrete. Depending on what time period, you'll have different instances. So here, very clearly, you can see what happens to you, could happen to you when you land in Naraka. So in this bottom center, you see that big pot where you're basically boiled, and then you have the demons that keep pushing your head down, just to make sure you stay in it. You can see the bodies of some who have landed in hell being suspended, Sanjyot hell, I would say, from their legs up in a kind of as a firmament. And then on the left, you can see the raging flames of the hell realms. These are actually the most prominent. If Tibet, we think of Tibet as South Asian, it's sort of on the cusp also, of course, of East Asia, then this is where you find representations of hell. And I often think, when you think of Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan tradition of Buddhism, there's a lot of emphasis that it has a Book of the Dead. It's very descriptive in sort of the negative spirit world, the demons. So it very much fits, I think, in that context. Now, where else do we have it? And for that, in Central Asian tradition, and again in South Asia, it's not that popular early on, we have to travel to Western China. And we travel to the oasis state of Kucha. And here you can see it on a map. Here it is. Right here. And it's one of several so-called city oasis states that exist in the first millennium CE. Now, Kucha is a place, at least archaeologically, archaeologists suggest that it was in existence from roughly the 3rd century CE to the 8th century CE. It was excavated in the early 20th century by a German scholar, among other German scholars, Albert von Lecoq, who worked at Kucha between 1905 and 1914. This is where he uncovered a lot of the murals, a lot of the Buddhist cave temple sites. And this is why also you have the largest collection of Kucha material in the Museum of Indian Art in Berlin. I hear that museum has just moved. So when it's open, maybe it's already open, this is a place where you can see some of the actual paintings. It's important to just talk about Kucha more broadly, because it's a very interesting place, quite a unique place, I think. Why? For one, it is the place where a very interesting language was discovered. It's called Tocharian. And Tocharian, we'll leave it at the language family for now, is written in Brahmi script. Kucha is very much an Indo-Iranian place. It's not a place that has been affected by Chinese artistic idioms, unlike Dunhuang, unlike Turfan. It's very much an Indo-Iranian place. But the strange thing about the Tocharian language is it's not Indo-Iranian. So there are two Tocharian languages. Linguists have systematized them into Tocharian A, sort of easterly more, towards the site of Turfan, and then Tocharian B, which is around Kucha. And they believed that Tocharian B was perhaps a vernacular language or a language that was spoken locally in Kucha. And that would be with other languages as well. It's not the only language. The Tocharian A tablets are much more, the texts are more Buddhist in content, whereas the Tocharian B are more economic and sort of social texts as well. Does everybody know Tocharian? I don't mean do you know, can you speak it? I have to rephrase that. Do you know of Tocharian? Yeah. So this is a map that best explains how it is connected. So it's Indo-European, certainly. It's related to Indo-Iranian, but it's closer to the European branches than it is to the Indo-Iranian branches. So it's like a little island in a sea of Indo-Iranian languages. And that makes it quite unique and very, very interesting. So Kucha must have been quite an interesting place. A lot of people have tried to point to a kind of Tocharian physiognomy of the people that are depicted in some of the Kissel or Kucha murals. So they'll point to, look, they have red hair, they have light skin, they have blue eyes. So they must be connected to the Celts or the... my argument to that would just be that there are lots of red-headed people in Central Asia. They're not just in Kucha, right? We have lots of information now in DNA information that suggests that Central Asia was just one of those places where you have a lot of mixture. So Kucha is important because of that. Kucha is important also for Buddhism and for those interested in East Asian Buddhism, because from Kucha comes Kumara Jeeva, one of the most important translators of Buddhist sutras. He was born in Kucha, and he was born actually as a member of the political elite. He was very much tied to, through his mother, a Kuchayan princess. His father was of Indian royalty. So he was a member of the political elite who became a monk. And he was very instrumental in translating the Diamond Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, Amitabha Sutras into Chinese. So in Qizil and in Kucha, when you go, you will have statues dedicated to this monk. Kucha is described by Xuanzang, a Chinese pilgrim, you all know, who traveled through Central Asia in search, on his way to India, in search of original texts that he could bring back to China. And I give you a couple of passages about the wealth in terms of the Buddhist tradition around Kucha. He says there are about 100 convents or monasteries in this country with 5,000 and more disciples. They belong to the little vehicle of the school of Sarvastivadin, and that most people would describe as Hinayana or better Nikaya Buddhist, much more closely related to the early Pali tradition. Outside of the western gate of the chief city, on the right and the left side of the road, there are two erect figures of Buddha about 90 feet high. He talks about the existence of colossal Buddhas, which were never found, by the way. In the space in front of these statues, there's a place erected for the 60 assembly. Every year at the autumnal equinox, during 10 several days, the priests assemble from all the country in this place. The king and all his people, from the highest to the lowest, on this occasion abstain from public business and observe a religious fast. They listen to the sacred teachings of the law and pass the days without weariness. So the political elites are propagating Buddhism as well, so you get a picture that this was a kingdom that really centered itself on the Buddhist tradition. Now, among all the sites that are contained in the Kucha oasis, there's Kissel, which is a rock-cut temple cave, a rock-cut temple site. Locally, it's referred to as Ming Oi. Qizil is the more common name that we hear in the scholarship. And here you can see it on a map. It too was uncovered or discovered or studied. Discovered suggests that nobody knew about it before Albert von Lecoq came, but I'm sure many people knew about it. He was the one who studied it and brought that knowledge to the Western academy. So here he is. I just wanted to show you these pictures because when he worked, this was the state of the cave. So you can see very run down. For those who have had a chance to visit will know that today it looks very different. This is in the 90s. They're starting to renovate in the 90s, and this is what it looks like today. When you look at it on the outside, that facade is completely new. I don't think it may have looked like that in the past, we don't know, but it's there for stabilization and also to allow access and to allow study of the caves. Now the caves are built alongside a river gorge, and here you can see part of it. Here's the river and there are the caves hewn out of the rock face. The caves are at higher elevation because in spring you would get spring floods, and that of course if you have caves very low means that those caves would be flooded and whatever was in it would be destroyed. So there must have been in antiquity, sort of in this first millennium CE period, a way to ascend those caves, but that that original structure has disappeared. I'll just give you some examples of the beauty of the caves. This is a very simple barrel vaulted cave, and here you can see in the barrel vaults there were usually Jataka stories depicted. And the names of the caves, I don't know whether you had a chance to read the catalog that I suggested in the bibliography along the Silk Roads. Old catalog of an exhibit in the Metropolitan Museum. You will know then that the excavators or the explorers of the caves gave particular names to each of these grottos, and they based their names on the most dominant image, right, of the cave. So the painting of the seafarers, you have the cave of the seafarers. Painting of the dome, right, this is the cave of the red dome. Here you can see other types of caves. They're hewn out. Sometimes you have two parts, right, with perhaps a place for a niche, and then here's the domed one with beautiful celestial Buddhas. There were pillar caves where there was a pillar left intact or a piece of the rock left intact, and so the idea is that you could circumambulate it. Right, and here you can see the two passages. And then here would be a niche for a particular statue or a painting. For those who know architecture a bit along the Silk Road will understand that this is a lantern roof. It's hewn out, it's not structural, but you see it in Sasanian Persia quite a bit, and you see it in Bamiyan. And in fact, there's a lot of connection between Bamiyan and Kissel in terms of the artistic exchanges. This is the cave we'll focus on in just a minute. It's interconnected caves. Sometimes you had passages, interior passages, where you could go from one to the other. Some caves were very simple, and people believe that they were residences, perhaps of monks. They have a bench. Perhaps you'd have a straw mattress there, and somebody could sleep. And they often have a little fireplace here. And they have a very strange entrance. You have to go in and then out, and that is probably to protect from wind and erosion, right, coming in from the opening. So you'd round the corner. This is a rendering of what a cave would look like. And there's a bit of a pattern in the caves. A lot of the sermon scenes are on the right of the entrance, and our depictions belong to sermon scenes. And then you'd have paranirvana, and usually at the back you'd have a large-scale paranirvana Buddha being depicted. Then coming out, and I think I forgot to bring the slide, above the exit, so when you go back out, there's often a huge image of Maitreya. Because when you go out, you're reminded, right, of the next Buddha to come. They've also found a bunch of clay sculptures, bodhisattva figures, many bodhisattva figures that perhaps were part or positioned in the niches, but there's not a lot of documentation on that. But they are beautiful. And some seem to have the exact same facial features, and they were made of molds. So, and then painted with polychrome. Now, Kissel is described, and Monica Zinn did a wonderful lecture on Kissel. I don't know whether you remember it. A year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, she came and delivered a lecture on the site of Qizil, and she talks about that it's an Indo-Iranian site. Artistically, it's Indo-Iranian. There's almost I don't think there is any Chinese penetration of Chinese artistic models. So in terms of the modeling, in terms of the types of dress, the jewelry, it's either Indic or it is Iranian. And this is also where that beautiful pearl rondel comes from. I think I've talked about this earlier. A Sasanian Persian pearl rondel that makes its way along the Silk Road all the way to China and starts popping up as decorative designs in painting, but also ultimately in textiles. Another reason why Kissel is important is it uses lapis. It has in particular the later paintings, have this very, very bright blue, ultramarine blue, it's called. And it's derived from lapis lazuli, which is coming from Afghanistan. The source for lapis at that time is to the west in the mountains of Badakhshan. So we're going to talk, this is an old map by the German expedition, and we're going to look at this particular cave. And here you can see the river and the various caves that are on either side. And it's very much, if you go to Yulin in China, it has very much that idea, how the architecture is executed. So it's called the Teufelshöhle by the Germans, or the Devil's Cave. For two reasons. One, it's the frieze that we're going to talk about. Second reason, it also includes paintings of Mara's demonic army. And so it was named the Devil's Cave. There are a couple of very interesting paintings, and I can't talk about them, but I'll show you a beautiful Digambara. It's almost like a Jain ascetic, and you can see the ring that he has right here. Digambara that functions in one of the stories of the Buddha. It has jatakas. I just have the drawings because a lot of the paintings are no longer there. The Visvantara Jataka, which is very popular across the Silk Road and in China, in Central Asia. You see it in rock carvings, you see it in Dunhuang, you see it in Miran, you see it all over Western China. It's the Jataka where the Buddha is born and then just as a king and starts giving away everything. He starts with all the royal symbols, the elephant, and then he ends up here giving away his children and his wife. And then, of course, everything is revealed, and he is lauded for his generosity and his selflessness, and then gets everything back. There's also a very beautiful Shiva and Parvati image right in the middle of the two caves. Here, seated. And it comes out of this area here. And then we're in a barrel-vaulted cave, and we're looking at scenes that are on the right side of the wall. And this is the frieze, and one of the few that exists that actually depicts the hell realms, not in the circular shape, but in a horizontal way. So I wanted to look a little bit closely at these scenes. And this frieze was discovered below images of the Buddha preaching. So the Buddha is teaching, right? And it may have been in the context of teaching on these realms and teaching on where negative karma will lead you. So if you look very closely, I don't know how clear it is. Do you see the two pots? Here are the heads of all the people who have landed in hell. See this? Monica Zinn wrote about it thinking that it was a pestle, that they're actually in a mortar and pestle. And they're being stamped down into the, either crushed, or cooked or roasted or something. And I'll give you a couple of the descriptions of hell because I think those are very important. Thousands of beings in this hell are confined each in a narrow cell where they are denied the exercise of the four postures. Fires blaze in their hands. While the fire burns, they cry out. As often as the fire goes out, they become silent. In this state, they suffer agonies beyond measure. And what's interesting, this is from the Mahavastu, right? Where you have the sermon on hells and then the individual hells are described. It describes why they're there, too. As a maturing of what karma are the beings being reborn there? Those who in this world enslave beings who are without protection or refuge, those who set houses and forests on fire, those who light a fire at the openings of den, burrows, enclosure, and traps of animals, monkeys, rats, cats, and the holes of serpents guarding the exit, those who destroy bees, they land in Raurava hell. The second one is, you can see the demons of hell here. They have blue hair. I always thought it was a halo, and that made me ponder whether or not bodhisattvas could go to hell, perhaps, right? And still tend to the people who are in hell. But Monica Zinn points to it's a little bit like a hairdo. It's curled here. And it's probably just the blue hair of the demon. The person, the naked person who's landed in hell is given a drink, and it's a drink of, in some instances, there are descriptions of molten ore. So you're forced to drink molten iron or molten over and over again. So there's a Tapana hell. The denizens of it are burned, hence the name Tapana for this hell, which is surrounded on all sides by spits of red-hot iron. There the denizens are impaled and roasted, some on one-pronged spits, others on two-pronged spits, and so on, up to 10. When one side is roasted, they start on the other side. Indeed, some of them, as maturing of particularly wicked and sinful deeds, turn round of their own accord. In this state, they suffer agonies beyond measure. Again, the Mahavastu explains why they are there. Those who in this world have caused living sheep to be fixed on a spit have rebirth there as maturing of such karma. This is again only a principal cause of rebirth there. Those reborn there reap the fruit of yet other sinful and wicked deeds. Here's perhaps a clearer picture, close up. These are all flames, so these are hot hells that they are depicting. In fact, I have almost never seen depictions of cold hells, even though they are described. It's always hot. This is a beautiful one, and now the demons have animal heads. And they're stabbing, they have spears, right? And they're stabbing the person who is kneeling. This is Kala Sutra hell. This hell, here the warders of hell drive its inmates from under a verdant tree, and by means of measuring rule of black wire, cut them into 8, 6, or 4 parts. They go on to cleave the bodies of some from heel to neck like sugarcane. They go on to cleave the bodies of others from neck to heel like sugarcane. In this state, The inmates suffer agonies beyond measure, and they do not die as long as their evil karma is not exhausted. And this is a very important premise in Buddhism. We always talk about Buddhism and the Indic tradition as kind of different of, say, Western traditions because hell is not permanent, right? Yeah, but it's very long. It may not be permanent, but it might as well be because it's eons and eons and it starts over and over again. And in fact, the Sermon on Hell in the Mahavastu suggests that you really go from one to the other. You know, you're just rolling on. And so depending on how much bad karma you have to work off, you can be there pretty much forever. But that's the difference in Buddhism. Everybody has some kernel of good karma in them somewhere. A good act that you may have done at some point, right? And if you can access that, if you can work off that bad karma and you can access that, you too have a chance to go out. And of course, in the East Asian tradition, when you think of Mulyan going down to rescue his mother, right? It's a way to kind of present that good karma, and you could have a better rebirth. This one I don't know. They have knives in their hands and they're hacking. Could also be Kala Sutra, hacking into the body. And here they're slitting the throat of the sinner. And this must be my favorite one. 2 mountains, and in between the 2 mountains you see the little heads. They're going to be crushed, because those mountains are going to move. They're going to move towards the denizens of hell and they will crush them. And that's very vividly described in the text. The hell is situated between 2 mountains. It's made of a fiery, flaming, and blazing iron and is several hundred yojanas in extent. The armed wanderers of this hell show the way to the doomed, and in terror they enter between the mountains. In front of them a fire appears. They have nowhere to go but into that ravine, and the mountains then move and meet and then crush them so much as sugar. The sugarcane metaphor is very interesting to me, and I don't know why. There's so much of it. But it does feel like when you get sugarcane juice, right? When you put the sugarcane through the machine to get the juice, that's perhaps what it feels like. So Kissel is one of the few places where you actually, in Central Asian tradition, and therefore by extension the Indic tradition, because this is really very much an Indo-Iranian world, get depictions of hell. Now there's one more, but it's a little more in East Asian artistic mode. And it's near the site of Turfan. It's at the site of Bezeklik. And some of you may know Bezeklik. It's a cave temple site. It's later. This is the time where there is immense penetration already of East Asian idiom, visual idiom, philosophical idiom into the region of Central Asia, also via Dunhuang. It's not circular either, so it's interesting. That wheel of life you don't see very often, at least best we can gauge. But they're compartments of hell that are depicted in a mural dated to the 12th century. And I'll just show you two pictures of those hells. Here is one, and you can see it's much more East Asian artistically than it is Indo-Iranian in the ways in which the dress is executed, the headdresses are executed. But here too you have all the oh God, I just realized it's just it's this contraption that is just going to spear into the person lying on this, I guess, offering table. And then the other one shows you. It's similar to Qizil in the sense that it has similar themes and could be depictions of similar hells, but they're executed in slightly different ways and are artistically very, very different. So hell goes from not existing, vaguely existing in this gloomy kind of netherworld, or not existing at all, slowly morphs into this binary space. And I don't necessarily mean just two spaces, because we have 16 at least in terms of hell, but binary states of beings. And you see it everywhere. You see it in West Asia, you see it in the Indic tradition as well. Despite the binary, though, in Indic tradition, they didn't seem to put a lot of emphasis on depicting the hell realms. And that's quite puzzling. Images are, everybody talks about images in the Buddhist tradition that are meant to be didactic, through images you teach. So you would expect perhaps a lot of images of the hell realms. But there are only a couple of places, and those places I have highlighted. I did go to your database, trying to see what was in the collection. And there it's very interesting. Some of the depictions that you have of hell, first of all, are much later, and also are very prominent in the Southeast Asian tradition. So there's a lot of depictions of hell in the later Thai art. So you have a couple of collections of banners, and if you look here at the bottom, you can see the denizens of hell all the way, while perhaps listening still to the Buddha preach. There's another one in your collection, similar setup, and then here you can see the hell realms at the bottom. And I hope that, there's a lecture on Southeast Asian traditions that the speaker will address. There's a very famous narrative that also appears in one of your objects in your collection. Pramalai was a monk. He's very much like Maudgalyayana. He's the Thai version of Maudgalyayana. He goes to hell and then recounts what he has seen and describes what hell looks like. But he's also one of these special people who's able to go beyond and then come back. And then in the East Asian tradition, there's far more sort of judgment scenes and scenes about the king of hell, the Yama equivalent, who is judging people as to their good karma and bad karma. So Central Asia, South Asia, not so much until you get to much later periods. You see it in Mughal and late medieval, and then the 18th and 19th century in particular. Whereas in East Asia and Southeast Asia, in East Asia it's a little more common earlier to have it in paintings, and Southeast Asia it's very common in the Theravada tradition of Southeast Asia. But again, a lot of those paintings come from the later periods. So the question you have to ask yourself, what is going on in those later periods that all of a sudden you have this emphasis on this particular rebirth realm? Yeah, found my word. Thank you very much.